I wasn't supposed to be there that morning. That was the feeling that settled in my chest as soon as I stepped out of the car and heard music drifting across the water. Not birds, not wind through the trees. Music, laughter, the sound of coolers being dragged across gravel. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd taken a wrong turn. I stood there blinking, one hand resting on the car door, staring at a shoreline that didn't match the one that had lived in my memory for years. Bright umbrellas dotted the edge of the lake. Folding chairs sat half submerged in the sand. A row of cars I didn't recognize lined the road that had always been empty, and right there, nailed cleanly into a wooden post like it had always belonged, was a sign that made my stomach drop. Public beach, day use only. I hadn't been gone that long, or at least, I didn't think I had. A man in a reflective vest noticed me standing there and started walking over, the way people do when they assume you're lost. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked annoyed, like I was holding up a line that wasn't even visible yet. "Sir," he said, not unkindly, but firmly, "this area is managed by the association. Parking's on the other side." I opened my mouth to explain, to say this was my road, my shoreline, that there had never been an association here before. But the words didn't come out cleanly. My voice felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. "I live here," I said finally. He glanced past me at the car, then back at me. "Residents would have a badge," he replied. "You'll need to move along." That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not anger yet, just the cold understanding that whatever had happened while I was gone, it wasn't small. Before any of this, the lake had been quiet in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived next to water long enough to know its moods. In the mornings, the surface would sit almost perfectly still, broken only by the slow movement of fish or the wake of a bird skimming low. At night, it reflected the sky so cleanly it felt like standing between two worlds. I didn't buy the property for its value. I bought it because it felt untouched, because no one told me what it needed to be. I didn't want neighbors. I didn't want foot traffic. I wanted a place that stayed as it was unless I changed it myself. That lake didn't come with amenities. It came with responsibility. I maintained the shoreline, managed erosion, kept outsiders off not because I was unfriendly, but because the ecosystem was fragile. Once people started treating it like a destination, it would never go back. Every fence post, every gravel patch, every narrow road leading to the water had been planned deliberately. Nothing was accidental, and everyone nearby knew it was private. That had never been a point of confusion. The houses in the distance had come later. A development sprung up over a few years, tucked just far enough away to pretend it wasn't close. That's when I first started hearing the letters spoken out loud. HOA. Always casually, always in passing. At first it didn't seem like my concern. They had their gates, their rules, their meetings. I had my land, completely separate. No shared roads, no shared utilities, no shared ownership, clean lines. The first time someone from the association approached me, it felt friendly enough. A man in a polo shirt, clipboard in hand, smiling like he'd rehearsed it. He introduced himself, mentioned how beautiful the water looked in the evening, asked how long I'd lived there. Then he said something that didn't sit right. "It's such a shame more people don't get to enjoy it." I laughed it off, told him that was kind of the point. He nodded, still smiling, but his eyes lingered on the shoreline longer than necessary. Over the next few months, it happened again. Different people, different phrasing, same idea. Questions about access, about whether I ever considered hosting events, about environmental assessments, about emergency use. None of it crossed into a demand. That's what made it uncomfortable. Everything lived in the space of suggestions, hypotheticals, just curious conversations that somehow always ended with the same conclusion, that this place could serve more people if I was willing to loosen my grip. I never raised my voice, never argued. I simply repeated the same line. "It's private." At the time, I thought that was enough. Looking back now, I can see the shift, the way the conversations stopped including me, the way unfamiliar cars drove a little slower near my driveway. The afternoon, I noticed someone standing near the tree line, phone angled toward the water, snapping photos without bothering to hide it. I told myself I was imagining it, that people were just curious, that no one would try something that blatant. The night everything went quiet happened faster than memory likes to admit. One moment I was driving a familiar stretch of road, the next there was only darkness. No dramatic buildup, no warning. Just the sudden sensation of falling inward. When I woke up, time had folded in on itself. 15 months had passed. Doctors spoke gently, carefully choosing their words. My family filled the room with looks that said more than they could explain. I learned about missed seasons, missed holidays, life continuing without me participating in it. What no one could fully explain was how much had changed outside that room. By the time I stood at the edge of my lake again, everything that once defined it had been rewritten, not through force, not through noise, through paperwork, language, and the quiet assumption that I wouldn't be coming back to ask questions. And as I watched strangers settle into chairs where I once stood alone at sunrise, I realized something unsettling. The lake didn't look stolen. It looked officially reassigned. The accident itself didn't feel dramatic. There was no slow motion, no clear image I could play back later and study. One moment I was thinking about how quiet the road was, and the next moment everything simply stopped. Not crashed, not shattered, stopped. As if someone had reached in and turned the volume of the world all the way down. What followed wasn't darkness in the way movies show it. There were no dreams I could remember, no endless black space. It was more like being cut out of time completely. Like a sentence that ended without punctuation and never picked back up again. When I came back, it didn't feel like waking up. It felt like being dropped into the middle of a conversation that had already gone on far too long. Machines hummed softly around me. The room smelled like disinfectant and plastic. Someone said my name with the kind of relief that carries years of waiting inside it. I tried to sit up and couldn't. My body felt heavier than it should have, like it wasn't fully convinced it belonged to me yet. A doctor explained, gently, that I'd been in a coma, not days, not weeks, over a year. 15 months. I remember thinking they were mistaken. Hospitals are busy places. People get things wrong. But the looks on my family's faces confirmed it before the charts ever could. Time hadn't paused out of respect for my absence. It had moved forward decisively, leaving me behind without hesitation. The early days blurred together. Physical therapy. Conversations I half remember. Relearning small things that shouldn't have required effort but did. Each day brought reminders of how much ground I'd lost. And beneath all of it, an odd pressure lingered. Like there was information everyone else had that I didn't, and no one was sure how to hand it to me yet. Eventually, I asked the question that had been circling my thoughts since the first day. Is everything okay at home? There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long. They told me the property was being looked after, that certain matters had been handled temporarily, that nothing urgent needed my attention right away. The words sounded reassuring on the surface, but they floated above the details instead of landing on them. I didn't push. At that stage, just sitting upright felt like a negotiation. I told myself I would deal with everything once I was strong enough to go back. When that day finally came, I expected relief. The drive felt familiar at first. Same road signs, same bends. But then the small differences start to stack up. Freshly painted lines, new directional arrows, a banner tied loosely to a fence that hadn't been there before, close enough to feel wrong. As I got closer, traffic slowed. That had never happened before. Cars idled, windows down, music playing. People laughed like they were on vacation. I pulled over, heart beating harder with every step toward the lake. The shoreline came into view in pieces. A cooler first, then chairs, then a stretch of sand that hadn't existed when I left. The trees near the waterline looked trimmed back, as if they'd been cut not for health but for visibility. And then there were the signs. Clean. New. Professionally printed. Public access. Community shoreline. The words didn't register right away. I read them twice. 3 times. My brain kept trying to correct them, to turn them into something else. A mistake. A misunderstanding. But the people around me treated them like law. Families unpacked towels. Kids ran down paths I used to walk alone. Someone had installed a trash station where I used to keep a small bench facing the water. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to match memory to reality. It felt invasive in a way I couldn't immediately name. Not loud, not aggressive. Just wrong. I took a few steps forward, intending to talk to someone, but before I could decide who, A man wearing a badge stepped into my path. He spoke politely, the way people do when they assume they're in control. "Sir, this area is designated for community use. If you're not part of the association, you'll need to keep moving." I told him I was the owner. His expression didn't change much. That was the troubling part. He glanced at a clipboard, then back at me. "According to our records, this hasn't been a private residence for some time." I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer directly. He said something about documentation, about temporary measures, about approvals that had already gone through. Around us, the lake carried on as if nothing unusual was happening. Water lapped gently against the shoreline. Laughter echoed across the surface. I wanted to raise my voice, to demand an explanation. Instead, all I could feel was disorientation, like waking up inside someone else's life and being told to act natural. As I stood there, surrounded by strangers on land I knew better than any map ever could, I understood something crucial. Whatever had been done hadn't happened overnight. It had been planned carefully, quietly, while I wasn't awake to interrupt the process. And for the first time since opening my eyes in that hospital room, fear settled in. Not of losing the lake, but of discovering just how official my absence had made me. I didn't argue with him right away. That surprised me more than anything. Every instinct I had told me to raise my voice, to demand answers, to insist that someone call whoever needed to be called so this mistake could be fixed on the spot. But looking at the man with the badge, it was clear he believed what he was saying. Or at least, he believed the paperwork he'd been given. He told me I could speak to the association office if I wanted clarification. The way he said it made clarification sound like a courtesy instead of a right. The office turned out to be a renovated trailer, parked just off the main road, with banners and signs neatly arranged outside. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of fresh paint. A woman behind the desk smiled when I approached, the kind of professional smile that never quite reaches the eyes. I explained who I was. I told her how long I'd owned the property. I mentioned the Coma, carefully, like I wasn't sure how much weight that word still carried. She listened. She nodded along, then she turned a monitor toward me. On the screen was a digital record. My name appeared once, buried in a list of notes and annotations. Next to it were phrases that felt deliberately vague: unresponsive owner, temporary community access, stewardship authorization. Temporary. That word came up again and again. I asked her who had given that authorization. She said it had been processed through the county after repeated attempts to contact me failed. There had been meetings, notices, deadlines. All of them apparently had passed without response. I told her I'd been in a hospital bed when most of those notices were sent. She paused. Not long. Just long enough to decide her next sentence carefully. "I understand this is frustrating," she said. "But from our perspective, procedures were followed." From their perspective. When I stepped back outside, a patrol car pulled up behind me. Not fast, not aggressive, just present. Another reminder of which version of reality carried more weight at the moment. The officer spoke to me quietly, explained that there was a dispute, explained that until ownership and access rights were clarified, the safest option was for me to leave the area voluntarily. I remember how strange that word felt, voluntarily, as if the choice were mine instead of a formality dressed up as politeness. I walked back to my car without making a scene. People barely noticed. To them, I was just another person leaving the beach. Sitting behind the wheel, I realized how little emotion I felt in that moment. No anger, no panic, just a hollow calm. Like the part of me that reacted to injustice was still catching up from 15 months away. Later that week, once the fog in my head began to lift, I started reading everything I could get my hands on. County records, meeting summaries, approval logs, documents written in language designed to sound careful and harmless. That's when the shape of it emerged. While I was unresponsive, controls had been put in place under the assumption that no immediate ownership decisions could be made. Maintenance, safety, environmental oversight. On paper, it all sounded responsible, even necessary, but threaded through those pages were small expansions of authority, timelines that extended themselves, permissions that quietly grew broader with each renewal. I learned that family members had been contacted, not pressured but overwhelmed, presented with stacks of documents and reassurances that everything was temporary, reversible, protective. And maybe at the time it was What changed wasn't a single decision, it was the accumulation of many. Once I began asking questions, politely, persistently, the tone shifted. Calls took longer to return. Answers became less specific. Phrases like ongoing review and under consideration replaced confident explanations. Then came the pause. Construction equipment stopped arriving. New notices appeared on the shoreline, this time mentioning evaluations and reassessments. Access hours shortened without explanation. People noticed. The lake grew quieter. A week later, I was invited to attend a meeting. This time, no one spoke over me. No one rushed to redirect the conversation. The same documents I had seen were reviewed again, but with more care, with added annotations, with questions where there hadn't been any before. By the end of that month, the public access designation was suspended. The signs came down first, unbolted, stacked, and loaded into a truck without ceremony. Then the temporary structures followed, benches removed, trash stations emptied, the sand barrier near the water slowly reclaimed by the shoreline. The lake didn't roar back to life, it settled. Standing there again, watching the surface smooth out, I felt something close to relief, but not quite. Relief suggests an ending. This felt more like correction. I didn't feel victorious. I felt aware. Aware of how easily absence is misinterpreted, how power prefers quiet moments where no one is watching, how systems move efficiently when the person at the center of them isn't available to object. Coming back from a coma taught me plenty about the body, about recovery, about patience. But what stayed with me most wasn't physical. It was the understanding that life doesn't wait for permission to reorganize itself, and sometimes you have to arrive back in your own story just to remind everyone that you were never done telling it.